So to start this unit, I'll talk a little bit about what food insecurity is. So to start, we're going to think about, instead of food insecurity, think about what food security means. And essentially it's having enough food, but it's more than that. It's really making sure that within a household, everyone in the household has enough food for a healthy life. So we know in the United States there's a lot of energy dense food available, like lots of calories, but that doesn't mean that people actually have sufficient food for a healthy life. So if we followed that, there's probably quite a lot of people that are not totally food secure in the way that you might think of. It's very common that in families, children might be food secure, but parents aren't. So, if any of you have children, you might think, well, if we get down to rationing or if we don't have enough food, then it would definitely go to my children first. And certainly right now in this whole coronavirus situation that we're in, that could be occurring right now where families are thinking about, in fact, I just talked to a staff member here on campus who's, worried about, do I have enough bread, for sandwiches? So maybe I'll have a half sandwich, and they have plenty to eat right now, but it's just being thoughtful about making sure kids have enough to eat. So when we think about what is involved in food security, what is, having enough food for a healthy life, there's five components we want to think about. One is quantity. So do people have enough food to eat? Um, Next is quality. So this is where nutrition professionals would be thinking about, the nutritional quality of food. Is there vitamin, are there vitamins and minerals? Is there fiber? Is this food going to nourish someone's body? Then we have suitability. So that's thinking about the cultural acceptability of the food. So just because somebody has, maybe they went to the food pantry and they got, 10 boxes of macaroni, if they have a predominantly Asian diet that doesn't have dairy and they don't eat macaroni type noodles, then that might not be suitable for them and culturally appropriate as opposed to having like rice or some of their traditional foods. Psychological food security component is really thinking about how people actually get their food. Does getting the food alleviate anxiety, and does it alleviate people feeling deprived? So things that you might think about would be how we give people food. So just because food is available, if someone has to go in a very public way or have to go through kind of a humiliating process to get the food, that might reduce the level of security that they have. So you could think about, even with kids, do kids have to, publicly show that they need to get free lunch, as opposed to, having a more discreet way of getting access to it? That would be sort of a psychological thing we'd consider. And then lastly, social. And they're kind of intertwined here, but is it socially acceptable for people to get food? So there's some cultures where it'd be very difficult to get like a handout, they would perceive it as a food, but it may be more appropriate, if you get like an EBT, like a debit card, as opposed to getting free food. Or maybe, the food, somebody can purchase a little bit. So it really depends on, the cultural context. But psychological and social kind of go together. So if we flip that, we talked about food security. If we flip that and think about food insecurity, that's when people don't have enough to eat in these socially acceptable ways. So the quality of the food isn't there. And we define food security in two ways. There's low food security and very low. So both of them are food insecure, but the difference is that very low means that people are at the point where they're actually disrupting the way they eat to make sure they have enough. So that would be eating less varied diets, like just eating top ramen every day, or they might be participating in assistance programs, which we'll talk about, or getting emergency food, so from food pantries. Whereas people that have low in food insecurity just means that they don't, they don't have enough to eat, or they're not meeting one of those five requirements that we're talking about. So if you look in the United States, our food insecurity level is relatively low. But we're a developed nation, so really it should be close to zero. So we have about 11% of households that are food insecure, and about 4% that are very low, that have very low food insecurity. And so when we think about the status of the people that are living with this, we know in the United States there's a lot of reasons that people are food insecure. If you're a young person, you've kind of grown up in an environment where student loans are expensive, wages have not increased. Like a lot of professions, the wage that they're making now is almost the same as they were making 15, 20 years ago. There's not been a lot of improvement in wages, and then housing is expensive. We have a lot of improved unemployment recently, but we know that there can be a lot of other reasons. Disability, so if people can't work, poverty, so if people just aren't able to earn enough money. And then the last is social isolation, which is a huge factor to think about as we're moving into quarantine and sort of a different way of life with coronavirus. If older people are socially isolated, they don't eat as much. People don't eat as much alone. And so being with people is a really important part of combating food insecurity. We also know that kiddos are more likely to be food insecure than adults. So 1 in 7 kids is food insecure. You can see here the overall of the food insecure households, about those 14%. It's higher among households with children. If we look at the trends of food insecurity, we are seeing that it rose around 2008, which is when we had the economic recession, and then it started to decline, which is good, right? So this is low, and this is very low food insecurity, and it's been on the decline. However, I have a feeling now with the economic disruption we're seeing, we're going to see that spike probably back up again once we get updated numbers. When we look in the nation about where food insecurity is happening, you can see this tracks really well with a lot of rates of chronic disease and other issues that we see in the United States. So the highest rates of food insecurity are, people that are in the South and Texas, and then you can see North Carolina, Ohio, somewhere in the Midwest. But additionally, if we look at a county level, we see that there's a lot of the highest rates of food insecurity actually tend to be in rural areas versus urban areas. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but a lot of it has to do with access. And white Americans are actually tend to be most impacted in rural areas versus urban. When we look at who is food insecure, we can see these two charts here. These are also in your textbook. I think these are updated, the ones that I have here. The main risk factors for being food insecure are going to be, of course, any household with children. You can see this is on the left is food insecurity, and on the right is very low food insecurity. So the percentage of households with children is higher. Single women with children are at a very high risk for food insecurity. When you look at race ethnicity, similar to all health disparities, we see Black or African Americans are most likely to be food insecure, followed by Hispanic, Latinx, and white. And then you can see it tracks pretty well in terms of where people live. There's food insecurity kind of everywhere. It's in metro areas, it's in cities, it's outside cities. So no one is particularly, very low food insecure. Although if you go to the low food insecurity on the left, you do see outside of metro areas. That's where we see more like rural food insecurity. Okay, so all right, that concludes this video. And next you'll learn more about what we're doing to combat food insecurity in the U.S.